It's Wednesday, November 22nd, and only 2 times in my life have I been in close to a major celebrity. The first time when I was about 12 years old, I was walking on a street in Manhattan, and I don't remember where I was going, and I don't remember what I was going to do that day, but I found myself walking alongside of Jack Benny. I don't know how many of you remember Jack Benny, but when I was a kid, he was a very famous. He was in movies, he was on the radio, even ended up on television. Now, the other celebrity that I came very close to is somebody that I was very familiar with, and I know exactly what I was doing at that time, and I know exactly where I was at that particular time. I was working in the post office, and I was out delivering special delivery mail. And I was on Park Avenue and 63rd Street, standing on one of the islands that separated Park Avenue. One side of the street went north, and the other side of the street went south. And while I'm standing there, a convertible was approaching, and I had to wait for it to pass. And John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, was in that convertible. And he passed me not more than 5 feet from where I was standing. Now, he didn't wave at me or anything like that, but he definitely saw me. And it was a thrill. It was a thrill to be that close to the President. And why am I bringing this up today? Well, today is the 60th anniversary of his assassination. So I want to review some facts about him and his family and a couple of other things that happened during his tenure, a much too short tenure as President of the United States. JFK, as he was called, was one of 9 children. He had 3 brothers and 5 sisters. And he was 46 years old when he was assassinated. A young president, something that we desperately need in this country today. In fact, he was the youngest president ever elected. There may have been some other presidents that came to office, but they weren't elected, who were younger than him. He was a Catholic. No Catholic had run for president before. So he had to speak to that issue. And he said, I am the Democratic Party candidate for president who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. That's what he said. Graduated from Harvard University in 1940, and he joined the U.S. Naval Reserve the following year. And during World War II, he commanded a series of PT boats in the Pacific there. And Kennedy's survival following the sinking of PT 109 and his rescue of his fellow sailors made him a war hero, and he earned the Navy and Marine Corps medals. But he was left with some serious injuries. And then, after a brief stint in journalism, Kennedy represented a working-class district in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1947 to 1953. And then he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and he served as the junior senator for Massachusetts from 53 to 60. And during that time as a senator, he published his first book, Profiles in Courage, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And then Kennedy ran for election in the 1960 presidential election. His campaign really took off after he appeared in the first televised presidential debate. And he was elected president by a narrow margin over Richard Nixon, who was at that point in time the incumbent vice president. So now, when JFK takes over the presidency, communism is on the rise. And we're involved in the middle of a Cold War, as they called it in those days. And as a result, he increased the number of military advisors in South Vietnam. In April of 1961, he made a major boo-boo. He attempted to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major disaster, a failure. He wasn't successful. And in October of 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missile bases had been deployed in Cuba. Kennedy was prepared to attack Cuba. But the UN ambassador at that time, Adlai Stevenson, stepped in and convinced the president to abandon his initial plan to attack Cuba and to consider instead the diplomatic option of dismantling U.S. missile bases in Europe in return for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Airstrikes against Cuba would have devastating consequences, Stevenson said. Bottom line here is it ended up with the U.S. removing missiles from Turkey. Russia removed their missiles from Cuba. And from this point on, we ended up with a nuclear weapons treaty that was signed in 1963. And then Kennedy went on to establish the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress with Latin America. And he also encouraged the continuation of the Apollo program, planning to land a man on the moon before 1970. And he supported the civil rights movement. But he was not really successful in that particular movement, because he only managed to get the passing of his New Frontier domestic policy. The civil rights movement didn't become anything strong until after his death, the president. And we had the first American in space when he was the president. And the Berlin Wall was built when he was the president. And John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times while he was the president, and then landed in the Atlantic Ocean. And segregation in transportation facilities was deemed unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled on that in 1962. In a 1963 speech in West Berlin, he made the famous statement, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Kennedy signed, I believe, the first nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union and the UK. And that happened in October 1963. Those are just some of the things that Kennedy managed to accomplish. But on this day in 1963, his life was cut short by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lyndon Johnson became president, and he stepped forward and he said, "Let us continue." And he framed his programs as a way of fulfilling Kennedy's legacy. And Johnson managed to pass the most significant civil rights legislation in American history. But for a generation of Americans, Kennedy's death would symbolize the end of a time of innocence and the beginning of a turbulent period in American history. And now, what we face in this country is even more turbulent than anything that was going on when Kennedy died. So I'll leave you with that this morning. A little bit of a history lesson. Bye.